Tenemos la suerte de contar en el Perú con la presencia del profesor Carlo Masala. Él es un profesor alemán activo en la Universidad Alemana de las Fuerzas Armadas de Alemania, con sede en Múnich, donde enseña los cursos sobre los temas que él investiga: seguridad global, escenarios de guerra, y todo esto naturalmente en una Europa fuertemente activada por la invasión rusa en Ucrania, por una parte, los conflictos en el Medio Oriente, la persistencia de conflictos en otras regiones del mundo, particularmente en África. En los últimos días hemos visto entre India y Pakistán. El profesor Carlos Masala, aunque su lengua es el alemán, nos va a contestar en inglés para que nosotros tengamos una idea de cómo los responsables de la seguridad nacional en Alemania tienen analistas y tienen académicos que prevén el futuro y que naturalmente hacen recomendaciones al poder político y militar. Professor Masala, nice to meet you and to receive you here in RPP. We would like to know at first how you will describe the evolution of Europe since the Russian invasion of Ukraine.
Well, actually, I mean, right from the start, the Russian invasion unified Europe. I mean, the reaction of Europe was quite unified against Russia with sanctions, then the military support of the Ukrainians. But over time, it split it more. So you have countries like Hungary and Slovakia who do not share basically the common view of the other Europeans on what's going on in Ukraine with regard to the Russian aggression. So Europe is now fragmented into a very broad coalition of the willing, led by France, Britain, Germany, and then a smaller group of countries who are basically opposing a too tough stance on Russia, which is mainly Hungary and Slovakia. So.
Yes. Well, you have in Europe the NATO since 1948. Most of the countries were already members of NATO, but some of them didn't like to do it, like Sweden, no?
Yeah.
Is characteristic, and they suddenly decide to come in the NATO. Which is the situation of NATO today? Because you get in some frictions with the United States, who warn even that they could leave the NATO if the European countries don't pay more in the budget of this military organization.
I mean, NATO is in a very precarious position right now. It's not that the US will leave NATO. This is not a scenario which is realistic, but we get information by the US from the US, like Pete Hegseth when he was in Brussels on the 12th of February, where basically the US is telling the Europeans that they're not going to be longer the primary conventional security guarantor for Europe, which is a total new situation, because so far the US guaranteed the security of Europe in case of any aggression against a European member state of NATO. And apparently this is no longer the case. So basically this means Europe has to get its guts together and, yes, of course, spend more on defense, replace what the US usually offers in terms of conventional capabilities to the Europeans. And this is a process we are currently in. I mean, so far, I would say every European country has realized that the situation in Europe fundamentally has shifted. So it's not only that we have a Russian aggression, but also that the primary security guarantor doesn't want to be any longer a European power. So this double challenge, external challenge, leads now to a process where basically European countries in the EU, but also European countries in NATO, are thinking very hard how to boost their defense in the years to come in order to be able, in case of any conventional aggression against a European country, to be itself.
To boost the defense means to spend much more money there.
Yes. Yes.
How can countries who got a big debt, how some kind of countries in Europe can pay more, even double more? Because what the United States like is you pay 3%. For global
3.6%.
That's a quite lot more than you are paying today, no?
Yeah. So the mechanism is basically a mechanism within the European Union. So the European Union set up a special fund which helps countries to spend more on defense. And even more important, the money which is spent on defense in every nation is excluded from the so-called Maastricht criteria. The Maastricht criteria basically tells every country how much it's able to get in depth, for instance. So now defense is completely out of this criteria, so which basically makes countries or enables countries to spend more on defense, which without basically risking their stability and austerity policy within. So we're talking about huge amounts of sums. I mean, honestly, what is in the European Union basically it is roughly around 800 billion euros. Which we talk about spending on defense for European Union member states. I come from Germany, so the incoming German government, which basically is going to come in next week, has already taken defense out of the national debt brake. That means basically we can spend on defense as much as we want without violating our constitution, which tells us basically that only 10% of the whole gross domestic product can be basically taken as debt.
Yes. You have some problems of budget with the United States, but also problems of goals of the war and the ways to get ready of the Russian invasion. The President of the United States, Donald Trump, has said that Russia is doing a lot of very hard concessions because he's not asking to keep the whole country. That's something that nobody in Europe shares. How can you get a common solution with the States, being that the Europeans have a quite different vision of what's going on in Ukraine?
I mean, first of all, the interesting thing is that the situation basically changes every day. Now, as we're speaking, for instance, Lavrov, the foreign minister of Russia,
yes.
has made it very clear yesterday, tonight has made it very clear that Russia doesn't agree with the US plan. So Russia wants to have more. That means the Oblast they annexed. They want to have a demilitarized Ukraine. They want to have a new Ukrainian government, which goes totally against what the US proposed. So therefore, the situation is always evolving. So we have no idea, how this will progress. Right now, as we speak, the Americans are getting closer to the Europeans because with the meeting Donald Trump had with Zelensky during the funeral of the Pope 2 days ago, I think, Donald Trump got closer to Zelensky. Donald Trump basically asked the Russians to stop with their attack. Donald Trump said publicly that he has the feeling that the Russians are pulling his legs, which is, of course, true. So the Russians do whatever they can do to delay any solution. So right now, I would say the US gets closer to the European view on the war, but I must say we don't know what will happen in 2 days because Donald Trump, in that respect, is extremely unpredictable.
Yes, and also because he has mentioned that if it's not possible to get a solution soon, the United States could leave.
Yeah.
And no longer care about the problem in Ukraine. What can happen in that situation?
Well, then the situation will get very rough because the Europeans are able to replace the money the US spends on Ukraine. But the Europeans are only partly able to replace basically or to substitute what the US delivers in terms of weapon systems. There are some weapon systems, especially in the field of air defense, which are not produced in Europe, and which the Ukrainians desperately need to protect the cities. So until summer, Ukraine has enough weapon shipment even from the US because whatever was agreed under Biden, Donald Trump is still delivering. But in summer, around June or July, then the Trump administration has to make the decision whether to have a new package of weapon deliveries or not. If they don't deliver weapon, then the situation gets very rough on the ground. So, and the Europeans are not able to replace everything. Does it mean that then Ukraine will lose the war? Not necessarily, because we see what kind of problems also the Russian armed forces do have in progressing in Ukraine. And the Ukrainians are now more and more able to stabilize the front. But yes, if the US pulls out of the whole scenario, diplomatically, militarily, economically, then of course, I mean, Europe has to decide whether to take the burden and to replace whatever the US did or not. And this decision is still pending. I don't think that the Europeans want the US to leave. They're trying everything to keep the US engaged, but we don't know whether they will succeed or not.
There is a problem, talking about weapons, with the nuclear weapons, because there is a kind of asymmetry in this sector, because it's France, the country who has more nuclear weapons, and then the United Kingdom, but not the other countries. What could happen if Putin does use nuclear weapons, as he suggests he may be able to do, and you will not be backed by the United States?
Well, actually, I mean, we have to talk about what does it mean that Russia uses nuclear weapons? Because, I mean, first of all, would Russia use nuclear weapons against European supporters of Ukraine, or would Russia basically use nuclear weapons in Ukraine itself? This is a total different thing. I would rule out that Russia would launch any nuclear attack against a European Union member country. But of course, Russia could basically use nuclear weapons in Ukraine. This would change the whole equation, because Europe wouldn't be able to respond decisively. Remember that in summer 22, Antony Blinken, the foreign secretary of the US, when there were rumors that the Russians might use nuclear weapons, basically made very clear that this would have catastrophic consequences for Russia. Europe is not able to basically threaten Russia with this kind of catastrophic consequences. But the risk that Russia uses nuclear weapons in Ukraine, according to me, is very low, because the Chinese and the Indians, the biggest supporters of Russia, have already said from fall 22 that the use of nuclear weapons is an absolute no-go in that war. So Russia would risk losing China and India as kind of economic, political supporters, and I don't think that Putin is able to run, is willing to run this risk.
Last question. Which kind of influence has all this war situation to the internal politics in countries like yours, Germany, or others? Because people are surprised, people are afraid, and people are disappointed after 80 years of the war to see spending much more money in weapons and being prepared to wars of this dimension.
Well, of course it is. I mean, it is an issue in domestic politics, because we have to spend more on defense. And of course, we have a limited budget. So people are afraid that spending more on defense will end up in cutting in social welfare programs. Therefore, this new government, this new German incoming government, has taken defense spending out of the normal budget to avoid exactly doing this kind of, guns and butter thing. So we need more guns and then people have less butter. Whether this balance will hold for the next years, we will see. But of course, it is an issue, and it generates also some heavy opposition among political parties. I mean, in the last German national elections, 25% of the voters voted for pro-Russian parties. 75 not, but 25 is a huge number.
The right, the hard right, no? The far right.
Yeah, but also the far left. I mean, there is this kind of Sarah Wagenknecht, it's a political figure in Germany, party, which didn't make it into the parliament, but basically failed by just a very thin margin to get into the parliament.
Thank you very much, Professor Masala. I hope you will have a very fructuous stay in Peru, and that we will hear with attention what you have to say, because you are coming of a country with a big experience, and you are working in a university created even for that, to think, and that civilians to think, to avoid wars. Gracias por su sintonía. Ha sido el profesor Carlos Masala, investigador y docente de la Universidad Alemana de las Fuerzas Armadas Alemanas.